I'd like to get started with the 5 o'clock workshop. I'm going to talk very short because I want to leave time for your questions and for discussion. And also I want to let you know, unfortunately, I have to leave in about a half an hour because I have apparently I have another engagement. So we'll talk fast. My interest in innovation, as I mentioned this morning, comes from a lot of different places. So I've started companies. I've actually gone from a piece of paper on my desk to a public company twice. I've done a lot of advisory work for startups and for big companies and for governments. I've written about innovation. I taught innovation at Harvard Business School for 14 years. I was a professor there. I have this music background. I've produced movies and Broadway theater, so I do a lot of stuff also on the creative side. I've never had a regular job. I've never had a boss, never had a salary, and hopefully I'll be able to maintain my unblemished record for the rest of my life. So I look at innovation as a practitioner. I do it. I feel like it's a way of life for me. I wake up in the morning, it's what I do. And it could be manifesting a business idea. I'm in the middle of 2 startups right now. So I have teams in London, Australia, Detroit, Michigan, San Francisco that are working with me on these. Also know I'm interested in this whole notion of how innovation works at a global level, and I'm working with leaders of innovation from a number of countries to sort of address the question of if you were Chief Innovation Officer of the world, what would you do? Right? Which is a different question from if you ran Skokobo or you ran innovation for Australia or whatever, what would you do, right? Because nobody, up until a few years ago when we started the Institute for Large-Scale Innovation, was really thinking about that question in any deep kind of way. So that's become the question that we have some degree of responsibility for, and that's been quite interesting. We're having a summit next week in Abu Dhabi, and our membership are coming together. Last year we did it in Washington, D.C. with the sponsorship of the U.S. State Department and the White House. Next year we're going to be in Beijing, and who knows, maybe we'll come to Moscow someday. So that's my background. I look at innovation in I like to make things simple. A lot of people like to make things complicated. I think there's already too much complexity. I like to make things simple. So to me, there are really only 4 questions about innovation that you need to think about. And if you have good answers to those 4 questions, you're ahead of 95% of the pack. The 4 questions are, what is it? How do you talk about it? How do you do it? And how do you do it over and over again? Let me just cover those very briefly. So what is it refers not only to how do you define innovation, and if you remember this morning I said, depending on what your perspective is, that's how you'll define innovation. If you believe it's primarily about patents, you'll count patents. If you believe it's about science, you'll count doctoral degree graduates from great universities. If you believe it's unusual ideas, you'll count unusual ideas. If you believe it's about design and creative industries, you'll pay attention to that. So having a definition of innovation that is useful for you, whether you're a company or a country, is the first part of what is it. The other part, I believe that innovation isn't just something that you do because it's a good thing to do, because it's very hard to do, first of all. And secondly, you have to have a reason for why you would make that effort, I believe. Right? It's not like just brushing your teeth. It's a good thing to do. So my definition of innovation is that it's the set of capabilities that allows for the continuous realization of the future that you want, of the desired future. So a few key things about the definition. It's about capabilities. A capability is something that you have to work hard to get, and once you have it, it's hard to lose. And let me make the following illustration. Let's say I picked on, you, and I said, tomorrow you have a great opportunity. You're going to give a jazz piano concert, and I'm going to have a piano here, and we'll all be here, and you're going to play. But I'm going to do all the things that a good manager does. I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to show you where to put your fingers on the keys. I'll make sure there's a great piano here. So good equipment. I'll make sure you believe you can do it, right? So I'll do all of the stuff that a good manager does. But unless you've been practicing in secret for 10 years, you're not going to be able to do it. So most managers, when they think about managing innovation, they do the hand-waving, the encouraging, they build a culture, they, get you the right equipment. But unless there's a sense of actually doing innovation and practicing it, and doing it for some purpose, innovation's the answer to a question, in my view, right? So if you just do new stuff, well, you get a lot of variety. But if you do new things that have a purpose, you can get transformation. And ultimately, if I were running a country, that's what I would want, or a big company. I wouldn't just want some new stuff. I'd want to actually be moving in the direction of some big purpose, right? So I think innovation's purpose is important. So that's question number one. Question number two, how do you talk about it? Well, most companies and most governments are really bad at communicating complex ideas that connect with people's emotions. So, they're good at expressing the content, but not necessarily they give you the steak, but not the sizzle, okay? If you're in a situation where you're trying to communicate about innovation, you need sizzle. You need a story. You need to engage people emotionally. You need to give them a reason for going on the journey, because it's a difficult journey, right? So strategic communications, I guess, is just to boil it down. The third point is, how do you do it? And there are literally 100 innovation practices at the enterprise and at the national level. And if we had 10 hours, I could fill all of these walls with the elements of innovation practice. But you still have to figure out how to put together the right system for your company or for your country, right? So how do you do it involves understanding what all the tools are, but then crafting an engine that's appropriate for you. And then finally, how do you do it over and over again is how do you create sustainability? Because in a company, if the CEO says, I like innovation, and then the next year the CEO gets fired or arrested, then maybe they're not going to do innovation anymore. In government, some minister says, I love innovation. It's like, the guy from Ireland, right? He was the head of innovation, now he's not, right? So hopefully something's still going on in Ireland. But, this whole notion of sustaining it means you have to have roots that go beyond specific people and their opinions. So how do you do that? Well, you do it by training, by learning, by pedagogy, right? So if you cultivate a new generation of innovation leaders, probably not going to go away, right? Then, why did Steve Jobs, for instance, when he learned that he was ill, commissioned something called the Apple Institute? I don't know if you've heard of it. The Apple Institute is basically a learning unit within Apple that trains people through the lens of Apple culture. And I know about this because they tried to get me to run it. And I said, thanks, but, there's probably somebody who will enjoy it more than me. But remember, I never had a job, right? So I was not eager to do this. But so he created this institute to support the culture to create sustainability. That's the same reason why they invested all that money in that funny-looking headquarters building, because that's meant to be a vehicle for the culture for the long term. And there are plenty of other approaches to sustainability of innovation as well. The important thing is to keep the question in mind so that it doesn't just go away after a year or two or become a fad where people say, oh, we did that, now we're going to go on and do something else, like quality or whatever. So, I could talk about a lot of different things, but I want to make plenty of room for you to talk and ask questions. As I said, I've got a lot of diverse experience at actually doing innovation and working with people who are doing it. So I'm not going to give you a lot of numbers and theory about incubators and accelerators and science parks and production of PhDs. I'm here to share something a little different with you. So I'm now going to be quiet and see what you want to talk about. Oh, so I have to speak Russian now. Where's my?
Господин Жункау, хотел задать вопрос.
Wait, one second.
Очень важно ведь не только те составляющие. Можно? Можно? Окей. Значит, я хотела спросить, вот сама идея важна, управление важно, а вот практически никто не говорил о команде инновационной. Кто входит и в команду, и на основании чего она подбирается, или коучинг осуществляется какой-то? Thank you.
So the question was, how do you formulate a team for innovation? It's a really good question. So, are you familiar with the theory of psychological types? Have you taken the test called the Myers-Briggs test? It's a favorite test of human resource. Yeah, please use mic. Oh, I'm sorry. So there's a psychological type theory which is expressed in a test called the Myers-Briggs. It's a favorite of human resource professionals. Looks like you're not that familiar with it. So basically, how many people here are fans of Star Trek? No, Star Trek. One. Okay. Well, okay. So I'll just explain. Star Trek is a team. It's a crew, right? And so they have the Mr. Spock, who's the rational guy. He's the science officer. And they have the radio operator, who's the detail-oriented person. And they have the doctor, Dr. McCoy, who's the feelings person and keeps asking, the captain, how do you feel? Or, that would be wrong, or we should do that. And as you know, in the Navy, I don't know if it's true in the Russian Navy, it's true in the American Navy, the ship surgeon is the only person who can relieve the captain in time of battle, right? So the doctor actually has a lot of power to make judgments. And then the captain in the story is the one who has the imagination to boldly go where nobody has gone before. So you have the four archetypal psychological functions of rational analysis, attention to detail, focus on emotional judgments, and intuitive reaching out for the unknown, right? So if you think about that, those are the four attributes that actually are about creativity and innovation. And if you had just a whole bunch of people saying, oh, well, we're going to dream up some cool stuff, but they had no attention to detail, well, they'd get into big trouble. But if they were all accountants sitting around counting beans, but they had no imagination, that would be a problem also, right? So the question in a high-performance innovation team, in my view, and now I'm showing you my medical training and my psychological training, is how do you get a mix of the psychological types so that the team is covering all of the different bases? And you think about what a good CEO is, or head of something, or president. They should be good in all of those things, right? Because their job is partly to translate among different people. So if the bean counter comes in and the dreamer comes in, the CEO has to be able to make a bridge between them, right? Has to be able to translate among these languages. But you also think about how the creative process works. It starts with, your intuition tells you that something is interesting. I think it's about internet banking in Russia or something like that. So my gut feel says it's interesting. But then I have to do research, so then that's my rational side. Then I've got to go off and think about it. And maybe in the shower, I get this big aha, right? Well, that's intuition, once again. But then I got to test the aha and see if it really is worth anything. So I'm back to the rational side, right? So the creative process isn't just the aha, the eureka, the light bulb over your head. It's an active process of going back and forth among these different psychological skills. And now that we have neuroscience that is showing how the brain functions, it's actually quite interesting to see the studies of how different parts of the brain light up in response to the different phases of creativity. And it's, for the first time, a kind of a physical, biological representation of what we've known all along in the theory, right? So, yeah, okay.
Будьте добры, скажите, пожалуйста, есть ли какая-нибудь критическая численность людей, в которой возможно появление достаточного числа инноваций? Допустим, в городе на 5000 жителей это маловероятно, потому что там таких людей будет ничтожно мало. А в городе на 500 000 жителей или на 1 миллион вероятность широкого появления большого числа инноваций весьма и весьма ожидаема. Вот как-то вообще связан этот процесс, по вашему опыту, с численностью жителей, допустим, населенных мест? Или нет? Спасибо.
So you're talking about in a society or an urban environment, is that what you mean? So it's an interesting question. I don't think anybody has an absolute answer, but generally speaking, it would seem that the larger the city is, assuming it's not large as in dysfunctional, like Dhaka, or some kind of it's a functional large city. There's going to be more creative output than in, let's say a suburban city of 100,000 people. And the reason is pretty obvious. You have a lot of different people, a lot of different connections, a lot of, cities are places where things get mashed up because you take a walk down the street and you see all of the different cultures, the different ethnic groups, the different occupations as you walk by. So you're constantly connecting things that are different. So the bigger the city, the more likely it is that you'll be making those kinds of connections. Innovation in cities is going to become a very big area of study, partly because these days cities are becoming important platforms for innovation separate from the countries that they're a part of. When you think of San Francisco and doing business with Denmark, for instance, or Copenhagen, you don't necessarily think that it's the US and Denmark. It's two world cities interacting. And new data is going to suggest that high quality innovation cities are much more supportive of high return on investment with regard to innovation in medium and large size companies. Okay, so there's research going on now that would show that if you're a medium and large size company and you want to locate in a high support urban innovation environment, because your return on equity is going to go up much higher than if you just go to an average city. But I'm just anticipating what these findings are going to be. I know in my gut that is true. Okay, so next comment or question or violent agreement or disagreement?
Во-первых, спасибо большое за ваш доклад, который был перед обедом. Он меня воодушевил прийти на мастер-класс. Спасибо большое, очень интересный был доклад. Я хотел бы спросить вот о чем. Вы несколько раз упомянули о культуре. У нас тоже очень много говорят об инновационной культуре, как о нечто особом явлении. Как вы считаете, что именно инновационную культуру отличает от других типов культур? Это первый вопрос. И второй вопрос. Что вы можете подсказать, как можно инновационную культуру построить? Что нужно добавить в компанию, чтобы культура стала инновационной, чтобы она изменилась? Спасибо.
So these are both great questions. The best definition of culture that I ever heard was that culture is what people do when their boss is not around. So it's the real behavior and beliefs of people when they're not being forced to act in a certain way. So if you take that definition, what do you want people to do with regard to innovation? Well, you want them to try new things. You want them to be courageous. You want them to experiment. You want them to not be too afraid of failure You don't want them to make stupid mistakes, but let's say they try really hard and do everything right, and something still doesn't work out. You want them to feel like that was a victory, not a defeat, right? There's an old saying in Silicon Valley that you should reward success and failure equally. Punish only inactivity. Okay, so yeah, so a creative culture would basically be focused on those kinds of behaviors and values. Now, how do you get that? Well, it's hard. You know, in a way, this is kind of like creating any kind of a story. If you're a great screenwriter or something like that, you have to kind of. Culture is something, you know, that we commonly understand evolves over a long period of time. When we think about anthropology and the studies of culture of indigenous peoples, you know, they didn't sit down and decide to have that kind of culture. It just emerged over many, many years or centuries. But in a corporate environment and in a social environment, a governed environment, sometimes you have to create the culture. Right? So then you have to start designing it. What is it, and how do you communicate it, and how do you support it with behavior? What is the role of the leader? How do you create personnel practices and rewards that support it? How do you shine the spotlight on behavior that is in line with the cultural values that you want? I think above all, how do you create a sense of urgency so that this cultural change will actually become something that people will want to do? Because changing culture is very, you know, it's a pain in the ass. You know, it's inconvenient. It makes people want to, you know, people have to behave differently. They have to change their habits. People don't like to do that. So you have to have a big reason why that's the case. One of my favorite examples of creating a sense of urgency is Jan Timmer when he took over as president of Philips Corporation, which, you know, was in really bad shape for all kinds of reasons. He had his first management meeting, and he put one item on the agenda, which was a newspaper from the day before, but he had it specially printed out, and the headline of the newspaper was "Philips Goes Bankrupt." And then there were all these stories about why it had gone bankrupt and what happened. And that was the only subject matter for the management meeting for that day. So he was able to tell a story and create an emotional reaction that in turn presumably motivated his managers to try to behave differently. Yeah, you have one.
Да, у меня такой вопрос. Здесь говорили про то, что важно сформировать команду людей, у которых будет одна идея, и даже если SEO не будет на месте, то они все равно смогут продолжать работать. Вот я бы хотел спросить, может быть, у вас есть какие-то идеи относительно того, как можно понять, может ли человек стать, например, участником такой команды? Можно ли как-то визуально определить? Допустим, когда принимать человека на работу, для того, чтобы узнать, будет ли он производить что-то, вообще будет ли от него какой-то толк, достаточно посмотреть на продукт, который он производил в прошлом, в своей жизни, на предыдущем месте работы. Например, мы хотим взять плотника на работу, на собеседовании просто можно спросить: дорогой друг, какие дома вы построили, покажи, пожалуйста, фотографии. Будет понятно сразу, может он работать или нет. Как поступать с инноватором? Можно ли как-то найти такого инноватора, как-то заранее узнать по его поведению или еще что-то? Спасибо.
Well, it's a really good question, and for me personally, I find that putting teams together and recruiting people is the hardest thing. First of all, because past success is no guarantee of future success, and also you never really know what it's like to work with somebody until you've started to work with them. And in countries where labor laws make it hard to fire people, you're stuck, right? So that creates a lot of inflexibility right there. In societies where it's easy to fire people, it's not pleasant, but at least you have freedom to keep working at it. So my my ideal team manager is Miles Davis. You've heard of Miles Davis, who's a famous trumpet player, jazz trumpet player. So he was famous for two things. One is he put together bands all the time, and they were legendary bands. So he was obviously very good at it. And someone once asked him, well, what's the secret of how you supervise these bands? And he said, it's simple, it's 4 words. Don't say too much. Okay, that was number one. The second thing is he made his best guess about who was going to be terrific. But also, you know, all of the chemistry between people you can't predict in advance. Nobody's that smart, right? So you have to just kind of do it for a while. And what he would do is he would put people together, and then he would say, doesn't sound good. And he would fire somebody. And he'd bring in somebody else. And then something else wouldn't be right, and he'd fire that person. And he'd keep going until he got his dream team. I mean, Steve Jobs, who was not the most pleasant person in the world to work for, although he commanded huge loyalty, was a genius at putting teams together because he was fearless about firing people. You know, I mean, you're not performing, the music doesn't sound good, you're not getting along with these people, you're fired. Next, right? So in a way, let me make another point, which I'm stimulated by your question, which is there's a real difference thinking about these kinds of issues as a designer as opposed to an engineer. So an engineer would have a specification and say, okay, I need to have a team with these people, and you know, I'm going to go and recruit them, and then I'm going to put the team together, and it's going to fit all of these analytical variables and checklists, and then I'm done. A designer would say, let's try it out. You know, it's like if you say, well, I want the most beautiful teapot in the world. Well, they'll make a model. And you say, I don't like it. Make another model. I don't like that one. Keep going until you see something and you say, wow, that's perfect. Right? So if you're a designer, well, if you're a designer of teams, you're going to feel free to, as they say, iterate and, you know, kind of constantly improve until you get to wow. You know, Steve Jobs, one of the reasons Apple is so successful is because he has a small core team of people, and they are a big wow. I mean, that's a team that's been through fire and ice, and they've been extraordinarily successful, and it's balanced, and it's there for, you know, it's there for a good long while. Yeah. What is that? I have to hurry up? Okay. I have to go. So let's take 2 more short ones, and I have to run out here. So you got the first one.
Today in the morning we noticed that it is only 4% of success in innovation in a line from scientist, entrepreneur, business, bigger business, and some 96% of innovation success is in a circle that implies big businesses. So I have 2 questions here. So what are the key differences between these 2 strategies of innovation? And second point, maybe it will be more productive to discuss more in detail that 96%. What are the key important questions to solve in that field?
So first of all, I'm not sure I believe that assertion. And it may be data that's collected from one particular place, but Facebook, Google, Apple, Intel, Juniper Networks, Genentech never started as big companies. You know, I mean, it's true that the odds of succeeding big are low, but I'm not sure the take-home message is don't do startups. Nor do I think the effort of getting new things launched within an existing company is always worth it, because it's very difficult. So I'd have to just go into the data with you to satisfy myself that it was real, because I don't think it, it doesn't resonate with my intuitive feeling for how things work. Yeah, okay, well then that makes 2 of us. Okay, last one.
Скажите, пожалуйста, как решается вопрос, если инновация дает экономию? То есть, ну, скажем, прорывной проект, который на порядок удешевляет и эффективнее решение. Вот у нас, к сожалению, нет механизма заработать инноватору на экономии. То есть государство здесь не предусмотрело никаких законодательств. А у вас решена проблема на экономии заработать, а не на растрате. Спасибо.
So I'm not quite sure I understood the question. Maybe you want to paraphrase?
Если инновации приносят, например, в 10 раз экономию по сравнению с принятым решением, то есть конфликт инноваций с устоявшейся системой. И есть ли механизм экономический, чтобы этот изобретатель смог заработать не на затратах, а на экономии, прорывной проект, то, что нарушает финансовые потоки. То есть в России это безнадежное дело. А у вас решена проблема такая?
Well, I guess what I can say really quickly is that there's a difference between incremental versus disruptive innovation. Incremental is improvement-oriented innovation, which could be about cost savings or greater efficiency. Disruptive is about changing the nature of the game. And you go about managing them in fundamentally different kinds of ways. I would have to be more of a student of the Russian situation to figure out why it was as big a disaster as you described. So I don't have an easy answer for that. I'm sure there's a very interesting answer, though. So one more quick one, and then I'm going to run out of here. I have no time. Just quickly. Yeah.
I was just interested about your position about the role of the government, basically, in the creation of economy. So, because there are several approaches, so should the government abstain from, let's say, intrusion to the innovation?
So basically, this is like a religious debate, and the truth is, government always has a role in innovation, but the question is how much. Some people say it shouldn't have any role. Other people say it should be all top-down. The truth is in between. Government should create the enabling conditions, but not to tell people what to do or pick winners or act like venture capitalists or entrepreneurs, because that's not what they're good at. But should they create the enabling conditions, be a source of demand, set standards, support public education, support stuff like this? Yeah, exactly. So these are enabling conditions. This is like a platform. So my email address is really easy. It's John, my name, John, at johnkao.com. So if you have a burning question that we didn't get to, I'm sorry I have to run out. Feel free to send me an email, and I'll be happy to try to respond. Okay. So good luck. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Thank you.